We'd like to welcome Dr. Elias this afternoon. He's Executive Vice President for the Advanced Projects Group at the Orbital Sciences Corporation. I think I'll let him go from here. He's got some interesting things to say.
I'm going to stand up at the podium. I like to wave my arms and point at things while I talk. Also, in view of some of the previous conversations that I've heard this afternoon, I think in coming here, it must be a masochist on a diet. Some of you may know where that quote comes from. To tell the story of X34, I think I have to go back quite a little bit. And I'd like to go back to September the 2nd of 1986, when I joined Orbital Sciences. I think I was the 20th employee. There were 20 people there, including the chairman of the board and the receptionist. Two different individuals, I may point out. We had a problem, and the problem was called Challenger. The entire business of the company was based on a product called the transfer orbit stage that's going to commercially boost a bunch of geosynchronous communication satellites from the shuttle to high transfer orbit, and that was going to be no more. So we were looking for an alternative business. And again, our objective was, hey, this is 1986, mind you, but we weren't the first ones to think this, of course. We got to find some real value added in space. We can't live off the government trough for long. We have to find consumer value in space. So the business of boosting geosynchronous satellites from a shuttle orbit to high orbit having disappeared in front of us, we looked at the idea of controlling small devices on the field, pipeline valves and stuff like that, using low altitude, very small communication satellites. Maybe we could put 6 of these satellites in orbit, and of course they won't cover the entire Earth continuously, but if you're doing things such as checking on the integrity of a pipeline or monitoring environmental data on the Amazons, why you don't need continuous coverage. So we thought of this remote asset monitoring system, and the first thing we looked for was a launch vehicle. Now we went around and we looked first of all at Scout, of course. What a fantastic achievement, Scout. Remember, it was designed in 1959. It was all solid. It did not have a guidance system. Scout was pointed at, and yet it had a tremendous reliability and accuracy record. Unfortunately, LTV had stopped building Scouts. There were 6, count them, 6 available, owned by the government, and they were all earmarked. We asked around the idea of restarting the Scout line, and they said, gee, unless you have deep pockets, forget it. We look at Amrock. I went to visit George Koopman and asked him about his launch vehicle. Went around the big commercial companies and General Dynamics. What can we do with Atlas? Can we piggyback? And it looked pretty bad. I remember coming back to Washington in early '87 and saying, hey guys, I don't think we can build this business because we can't get there. And of course it was this pregnant pause. And we said, well, what if we build a launch vehicle? Nah, no way. Well, except we couldn't get the business going without it. And that's how Pegasus was produced. A lot of people think that Pegasus was a product of OSC in the sense that we wanted to build a launch vehicle. No, it was a means to an end. And it still is to a certain degree. Now, there's a few things that I think went very well with Pegasus, and a few things that did not go very well with Pegasus. We certainly had hoped to bring it down in cost a lot more of what it did. Now, it did represent a significant improvement over Scout. I tried to get all the data that I had in Scout. Now, this is very difficult, of course, because Scout was never sold commercially. But the best I can come up with was in 1972, when a big batch was built, and this was kind of the last quality of grade on Scout. Each of the vehicles came out about $3.5 million each. Now, you have to be very careful with what kind of inflation factor you use. So I used the fact that in 1972, I bought a Chevy Vega hatchback for $2,000. And now I can buy an equivalent car for about 10. So using cars as a measure of that is a factor of 5, which means a Scout of then is as if I was going to pay $17 million for it. And you could put about, 500 pounds, depending on which orbit you go. The number turns out to be about $4,000 per pound. Now you just heard Dana talk about 4,000 is an expensive number for large vehicles. 1,000 is something we could dream of. 500 is where the goal is. Now in the small launcher, in the small satellite business, and again, remember we're comparing two different markets and two different worlds, I would kill for $4,000 a pound. As a matter of fact, I am, as Dana said, betting the company on getting to $3,000 to $4,000 per pound. But anyway, back to Pegasus. Where we were lucky or smart in Pegasus and where we were dumb or didn't quite make it. Well, we hit the development money quite on the spot. We figured out it was going to cost about $50+ million to develop it. And indeed, depending on exactly which of the flights you say that's the end of the development program, somebody has estimated that the first 2 flights were development. If you include the cost of those first 2 flights, it probably was about $62 million. So we hit that pretty much on the nail. Another area where we're very happy with what we achieved with Pegasus was in the amount of money that it takes to put the rocket together in the field, bring in the satellite, assemble it, and launch it. In our case, under an airplane, but in our case, all our vehicles put it on the launch pad. Everything you have to do until you give the customer a launch report. Mike Griffin, formerly from NASA and Space Industries, wrote this paper a few years ago where he estimated that the average cost of Atlases and Deltas and so on and so forth, when you divide the total labor that you need to launch them by the empty weight of the vehicle, as a kind of non-dimensionalization factor, it's about 10 labor hours per pound of dry weight. Now, interestingly enough, the shuttle is not that far off that number. The only problem with the shuttle is that it takes a lot of dry weight to put a pound to orbit, and that's why it appears to be so expensive. Now, looking at the last 9 Pegasus launches, I estimate that we spent about 6,000 labor hours doing this whole field and launch activity per launch. Now, Pegasus weighs 7,000 pounds empty, so we're already below the 1 labor hour per pound of dry weight. Now, lest we become too cocky, I have to remind everybody that X15 costs on the average 0.8 labor hours per pound of its dry weight to operate, and it was a very high-performance system. So that's one area where if you look at all the costs that go into launching, I don't think we can squeeze any more blood out of that turnip. Where's the area where we went wrong? Well, we thought we could build space hardware for about $300 to $400 per pound, and we failed. We cannot build quality, reliable, tested, qualified space hardware any cheaper than Boeing builds 777s or anybody else does this kind of quality work in industry, which is $1,000 to $1,500 per pound. Now, I'll get into the precise material on X34 for a minute, but I'm very uncomfortable giving pitches without showing pictures of hardware. I hate view graph engineering. So I figure out I'd give some color to this pitch by showing some hardware. And since I boasted about how we did, I think, achieve some improvements in field operations cost with Pegasus, I'd like to show you how we did it. Well, this is our magnificent vehicle assembly building at Dryden Flight Facility in California. And as you can see, it's a metal Butler building, about 80 feet long and 60 feet wide, 2 roll-up doors. And what you see there in front is a tar van, is a trailer on which the motors arrive at that facility. That facility has no cranes, no way of lifting things. Next to it are our luxurious offices. Actually, our offices are these 2 trailers, because this is the payloader's trailer. That's where our customers get lavishly treated. We're actually a little better equipped at Vandenberg. Now, here's how the motors arrive. We designed the equipment, we designed the ground support system at the same time as we designed the rocket itself. This is our assembly and integration trailer. As you can see, it has 6, we actually took away the 2 middle jacks, 6 electric jacks. They elevate to the same height as the van. And the motors come from the Hercules factory in Salt Lake City on these dollies. Now you'll notice that this middle dolly has all sorts of junk in there. That's a 6 degree of freedom dolly. The front one is a single degree of freedom, just a track, because you use this guy's capability to align the two stages for mating. And the two dollies of the first stage that are seen here only have 4 degrees of freedom because all they have to do is align the rocket for mating on the B-52. There are the stages being mated. Now you can see we've lowered the trailer bed. And here's the vehicle taking shape. We put the wing in there. There's a payload fairing. That's Bob Lovell, the program manager, looking at the fairing. He was the oldest member of the team. The average age was about 30. Here's our first satellite, the NASA Goddard PegSat. It was a mini CRESS experiment with 2 barium canisters, as well as the ARPASat satellite. Sorry, Cheap Experimental Communication Satellite, abbreviated CHIPSEX. And here's the payload with the fairing ready to be installed. As you can see, no cranes, just a little davit in here, and a very austere facility, lots of foam blocks to hold things. And here's the entire gang, actually more than the entire gang because there's a few satelliters in there. I'm the one taking the picture, that's why I don't show up in here. I show up in a little picture later. And here it is, ready to roll off. We've added some wheels in the rear and the front of the trailer. Roll out the building. As you can see, it has doors on both sides, and we're installing the adapter that mates Pegasus to the wing glove of the B-52, the same wing glove used on the X-15 program many years ago. And here we go, the crack of dawn the next day towards the runway. Now, all of these people are OSC employees. There's a bunch of NASA Dryden folks a little bit later, but essentially it's a bunch of guys from industry. I think I'd like to point out that Pegasus, I believe, is the first orbital launcher that was developed by a bunch of guys, not under a contract by the government. Government didn't, well, they knew we were doing this because they were helping us with B-52, but it was our money. And here we are getting under B-52. This is actually a composite of a couple of shots and an inert. By the way, this is me pulling on a wrench to try and align the track laterally. And here we are, we're ready to take the trailer off. As you can see, there's some daylight in between the trailer and the rocket. Air conditioning system, very complicated, 2 window units. On a, actually, they have HEPA filters, so it's pretty good quality air. And our diesel trailer with a diesel generator that provides power for air conditioning and everything. Those payloads end up being quite clean. At last chance, that's literally the name of that place, the runway threshold, ready for takeoff. Here we are starting to accelerate. The B-52 is a grandfather from the California Clean Act law. And here we are getting to launch position. Here's our crew in the control room. Now you have to understand the entire launch is controlled from the B-52, or right now from the 1011. One person, well, 2 people run the show. The launch panel operator, I was the LPO on the 1st and 4th flights, does all the switch turning except the last one. The pilot pushes the last button. These guys are just watching on the ground, keeping management happy and far away from operations, and having a lot of, eating a lot of Rolaids. Actually, what they do is they provide the LPO a very basic support function. They help everybody with a go, no-go decision, but they can't control anything. Everything is controlled from the airplane. So, theoretically, you could get rid of them. Here it is, drop, 5 seconds delay in the ignition, getting there, chase aircraft in the back. Now this is a unique picture. I've never seen quite the beginning of an ignition, and this was out of a 60mm frame. I think we lucked out on this one. And up it goes. Notice the angle between the fuselage of the rocket and the plume. Normally in a normal launch vehicle that means you're in trouble. Well, I'd like to continue the flight, show you what the flight is, but in order to show you what the flight is, you'd have to be Major Kong sitting on the rocket. Fortunately, we did that. Now, let me see if I can turn this TV on. There we go. Now, I realize some of you may not be able to see this, so I'll have the videotape available here, perhaps afterwards when you want to see it. There we go. Let's see if we can turn the volume up a little bit. Can't see this. Watch in the top right side corner of the screen the plume of the F-18 at full afterburner.
12, 13, 14, 15.
We're already at Mach 3.
17, 18.
There it is.
19, plus 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25.
There's a B-52.
26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31.
Probably Mach 4.5 or 5.
33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, plus 40, 41, 42.
We actually reached Mach 10, but then because of the vagaries of the atmospheric temperature, the Mach number goes down because of the temperature.
49, plus 50.
You can see the TPS starting to ablate.
5, plus 60 seconds.
This purple tinge, we believe, was outgassing from the TPS. It'll clear away in a minute.
P plus 70 seconds. Mark.
Now you will notice we do have a pyrotechnic separation system.
P seconds.
Keep your eyes on the wing.
Mark. P plus 90 seconds. Mark.
There we go. And second stage ignition. Okay, now, there's the first stage. From now on, the flight looks very much like a rocket, so it means it's boring. Let me see if I can put the lights on again. Okay, now I have to restore this silly view graph projector. Thanks for your patience. Well, as I mentioned, we were able to reduce somehow the cost of launches in the small scale. Now, as you are all aware, there are some significant diseconomies of scale as you go to smaller launchers and smaller satellites. So what is a very good cost per pound at the 1,000 pound range is a terrible cost per pound at the larger ranges. Now what this chart tries to show is that there was a family of classical vehicles that existed, since the 60s and the 70s, mostly outgrowths of ICBMs, that was of course never an ICBM, but some of its stages actually originated in some of the solid tactical missiles that JPL originally developed. And interestingly enough, there's some diseconomies of scale. What hurts you here is the fact that, hey, your guidance system is your guidance system, whether you're a Scout or an Atlas, and it weighs about the same. Why does the curve go up here? I'm not exactly sure. Perhaps fewer flights, the fact that the vehicle is large and cumbersome, the fact is it goes up. Now, in the 1980s, a number of things happened. There were some important evolutionary improvements of the historic vehicles. McDonnell Douglas came out with the Delta II. Ditto for Atlas II. We came out with Pegasus, which through a combination of technology, hey, after all, this was late 80s. No wonder we did better than Scout. We came out with Taurus. By the way, who's mentioned earlier that the U.S. had not developed any new launch vehicles in the past 5 years? Dr. Webb, did you say that? Well, you're right, because Pegasus flew more than 5 years ago, but Taurus flew about, when was it, 2 years ago or something? Lockheed is trying to fill this curve with a couple of very impressive launch vehicles. We hope pretty soon to see Conestoga on this line. We are all hoping that their launch will finally occur. We've all been waiting for it, especially for the Comet reentry launch. Comet will do for reentry, I think, what Pegasus did for launch vehicles, the first commercially produced reentry system. But we're all kind of on this line. This line represents the 1980s technology. Now, some disturbing things are happening, i.e., the Russian launch vehicles. We've competed against the Russians in 3 cases. We won 2, lost 1. We won 2 not based on cost. We were more expensive. In the case of Spain, the Russians simply told the Spaniards, tell us what OSC is charging you, we'll charge you $3 less. I wonder what they would say if we decided our price was $3 million. And we see some additional efforts to further evolve and improve the expendable launch vehicle family. But we think that if we continue to do this, certainly the Russians are going to eat our lunch, and we will not see the kind of snowballing of small microsatellite developments that we had hoped to do with Pegasus, which we didn't quite see. So our idea a couple of years ago, and we started around spring of 1993, was perhaps we could do through reusability what Pegasus and others did for the previous curve, i.e. go to a new technology line. So we have to be a little bit careful when we think about X34, whatever you want to call it, as stymieing out competition. Well, there's 2 ways of looking at it. Is it stymieing out competition on this line? Or is it stymieing competition because it's a transistor developing and the vacuum tube radio companies are going to get hurt? There's 2 ways of looking at it. This word chart has repeats a little bit what I said. When we started this effort in spring of '83, we really looked at everything. I leapfrog immediately to reusability because that was a punchline, but we were actually pretty thorough. We look at major enhancement of Pegasus, and we found out that air-breathing propulsion does have tremendous advantages. We spent a lot of effort trying to define a low-cost, afterburning turbojet that could be used by Pegasus to accelerate it from Mach 0.7, the drop conditions, to about Mach 2.5. Now you'd say, hey, wait a minute, that's less than 2 Mach numbers of acceleration. Is that really worth the effort? Well, those of you that know the rocket equation realize that it's the first foot per second of delta V that costs the most more fuel. So if somebody's going to give me 2 free Mach numbers, for all practical purposes, the ISV of air breathing is free, I'd rather put those 2 free Mach numbers at the beginning than at the end. So the idea of using an air breather to accelerate a rocket from Mach 0.7 or Mach 0 to Mach 2 is not as silly as it seems. And that's, of course, the basis of Black Horse and other concepts like that. The problem we had was that there was no way we could build those low-cost afterburning turbojets for less than several $1 million after a $50 to $100 million development program. So there's a case where the expendable aspect of the vehicle killed the initiative. We also look at small dumb boosters. Can we go through hydrogen peroxide, very low-cost, one-tank graphite technology? Could we do $100 to $200 per pound hardware manufacturing? The problem with that approach is that we found ourselves using a lot of the arguments that we had originally used with Pegasus as to why we could build Pegasus for $300 per pound. And there was this tremendous feeling of déjà vu. So we finally opted for various forms of reusability. Now, here we were faced with exactly the same problem that Dana described a minute ago, which is you have to amortize your development costs. Now, I'll show you an example later of the kind of thinking that went into arriving at the conclusion. But the conclusion was that for this size vehicle and for what we wanted to do, now let me make sure that I do not believe this is a universal solution for all size vehicles and all markets and all objectives, but for what we wanted to do, a 2-stage 90% reusable, well, depending on whether you measure it by weight or by cost of the various elements. But what people call a pop-up, if you ask Jess Funneman what our X34 concept is, he said, oh yeah, it's a pop-up concept. So I don't think we invented it. But a LOX kerosene, interesting, not hydrogen. A LOX kerosene, 90% by driveway, 90% by hardware cost reusable system, kind of minimize total costs, including amortization. And I'll go into a little bit more there. By the way, air launch is used on our X34 concept for different reasons than it is used on Pegasus. And we'll see that in a minute. We had a problem though. The problem was this. We look at the market and we made an assumption on the elasticity that Dana kind of gave you a little bit pitch about. And for the lack of better data, and we believe we have the best data on small satellites because we saw what Pegasus did to the market, we assume that the market is unitary elastic, elasticity of 1. So that means if we are successful in reducing the launch cost by a factor of 3, there should be a roughly factor of 3 improvement or in the number of launches. Unfortunately, that improvement doesn't happen instantly. People have certain lag going from one launch system to another. But we did all of our numbers, and we found that in order to develop this system, and again, this was an extremely low recurring cost system, we needed between $150 and $200 million. Interesting, that's 3 to 4 times the cost of developing Pegasus for a system of roughly or maybe a little bit more payload capacity. However, if we go through this, 20% was the number Dana used, 25% is the number we used because we were a little bit more afraid of what we were doing. In order to justify the investment, we need an IRR of 20 to 25%. If we look at the times 3 present market that we think the reduction in cost is going to produce, and we look at this oddity, that what we want to do is reduce the cost per launch, which means we even have less money per launch to recover our investment. We can, from a purely commercial standpoint, we can only justify investing between 100 million to 120 million on this. Now, this is independent of whether the money is there or not. So it's not an issue of, is there financing available? Even if there were financing available, we cannot justify to our stockholders or to a bank in New York or to anyone investing more than 100, 120 using the kind of midpoint market, which itself is 3 times today's market. And let me tell you, this is not a breakthrough market, I understand, but still, a change by factor of 3 in the market is something that investors really gulp at. So, we're stuck. We can't do it. A little bit of the same conclusion that the CSTS concluded. Unless we could find an additional, separate, different usage for this system. It had to be something other than launching satellites, or else it doesn't count because we've already included that in the calculation. And we noticed, and at this point perhaps I should deviate and show you what the system consists of technically. This idea of 90% reusable looks roughly like this. This is our 1011 Stargazer, the one we're now using to launch Pegasus. And through the miracles of computer-aided image generation, I've put in here our original concept, and it wasn't called X34 at the time. Hanging under the 1011, again, it has the vertical fin in the side of the 1011, same as Pegasus has. And we go out, and here's the important difference between Pegasus and this concept. We go out from the airfield about 800 nautical miles. At that point, we turn the aircraft around, we point back towards the airfield, drop the rocket. Now this is a liquid propelled rocket, so it has some characteristics different from Pegasus, but it still uses a wing for lift. And it accelerates, but it only carries enough fuel for about half of the delta V that you're required to go to orbit. However, it does go exo-atmospheric, so at one point in time you open a, relatively speaking, gigantic payload bay, because it has to carry not only a satellite but also an upper stage. And we throw out an expendable but relatively small upper stage or orbital vehicle. Now, this is the expendable part, this is a reusable part. Let me give you a couple of numbers for comparison. This puts roughly 1,000 pounds of payload to orbit, maybe a little bit more. This orbital vehicle, empty, weighs about 800 pounds, maybe a little bit more. So it's about the same amount of mass as payload. This whole thing that weighs about 18,000 pounds at landing re-enters, and it's used several times. By comparison, shuttle, which puts out, what, about 40,000 pounds of payload in round numbers? Every time it flies, it throws away a roughly 80,000 pound piece of very carefully crafted, tested aerospace structure, i.e. the external tank. Notice that I'm giving the shuttle the benefit of the doubt of the SRBs, which in my opinion are not really reusable. They're recyclable, same as an aluminum can is recyclable, maybe a little bit better than that. So indeed, this system is more reusable, at least on a per pound basis, than shuttles. And well, after doing that, very important to remember to close the payload bay because you're going to re-enter. Now here we have some good news and we have some bad news. The good news is that we're re-entering about half orbital velocity. So if you believe in Chapman's equation that the heat load depends on the cube, or 3.15 if it's a laminar thingamajiggy, of the velocity, you're coming from half the velocity, so only 1/8 the heat load. The bad news is that shuttle or any other vehicles returning from orbit return about 3 degrees flight path angle. This guy re-enters at the flight path angle it had when you shut off the engine. What goes up must go down. It's about 22 degrees. So as a matter, that increase in the square root of rho over rho zero term of the Chapman equation is such that it's going to have a very high intensity pulse, as high as the shuttle coming from orbit. But it's going to last 5 or 6 seconds, and not the minute and a half of the large peak loading shuttle, which means we don't have a soak back problem, but we are going to expose the vehicle, for good or better words, to orbital reentry kind of peak loads. And of course, the conclusion, happy conclusion I hope, is this thing lands. By the way, when it lands, it has about the same wing area and about the same dry weight as a large business jet, and it is empty. Now, one of the previous speakers noted all of the problems that we have with the ranges. We, as well as the X33 people, are convinced that we're going to have to overfly inhabited areas. And as far as we're concerned, we want to look at this vehicle as an unmanned aerial vehicle. If we do go out the Pacific Ocean, turn around, shoot back towards Edwards, and recover at Edwards, it is true that most of the powered arc is going to be over water, but still, we're going to be overflying California. We would like to be treated by the FAA or whomever as a 18,000-pound unfueled glider. If we have the reliability to have the economic operations that we want, this thing has to fly many times without crashing. Therefore, it has a reliability given the exposure time that the general public is going to have, not to present a bigger hazard to the community than all those commercial aircraft flying on top of it. That's our objective. We did have we did build a mock-up for a number of reasons about a year ago. As a matter of fact, before the X34 term was coined. This is full size, and when you see it, you realize, my goodness, this is big. This is humongous. I mean, this is like 40% longer than Pegasus, more than twice the wingspan, 4 times the wing area. It is relatively large. Since then, we've made a major modification to the configuration. The NASA, one of 2 NASA Boeing 747 carrier aircraft has been made available to us. Now, this is something that 8 months ago, somebody would have said that I could go to NASA and ask for the use of one of their precious SCAs, and we've been brawling on the floor with laughter. Surely you jest. Well, to my great surprise, JSC and Code M came to us and said, hey, we know you guys are using your Rocket 1011. Doesn't that kind of crimp your style a little bit? You have a big constraint on height and everything. And we said, yes, we wish we could use a 747 or something like that, but you don't have the money to go out and buy a 747 and do to it what we did to the 1011. He said, well, how about using one of ours? It is a different world. NASA is changing. Well, we heard this morning how NASA is changing. There are new people coming in that have a completely radical mentality. NASA works for industry, not industry for NASA. I'm not sure everybody is up to speed on this in the agency, but those that are the ones that are surviving the cuts. There are other examples. On X34, the way the cooperative agreement ended up being worked, there are 4 NASA centers, each with a kind of unique capability that we can't go out and find in industry, working as subcontractors for us. Reverse contracting, maybe? Now, having shown this, let me give you, for the first time ever, I think, a picture of the current 747 base configuration. And as you can see by the date of the sketch, 5/18, it is pretty fresh off the press. Here are some of the main characteristics. Now, that payload bay is big, man. It's 10 feet in diameter by 30 feet in length. It has to store an upper stage. Today, a relatively low energy upper stage, a LOX kerosene. Tomorrow, maybe a LOX hydrogen upper stage, maybe something else that's not an upper stage. I'll talk about it a little bit more later. So, to think that this is simply a slight modification of Pegasus, I think is a little bit of an understatement. Now, let's go back here. How do we get those, well, in the best case, $30 million gap in funding, in the worst case, $100 million gap in funding? Where do we get it? We have to find an alternative application of this vehicle that has nothing to do with launching satellites to orbit. Well, we noted that we have this big payload bay. It was a little bit smaller on the original model, but still. We can accelerate several thousand pounds of payload to Mach 12, 13, 14. Well, this is what NASA wanted to do, to test some of their hypersonic scramjet combustion systems, which, by the way, I'd love to have one of those for this vehicle because it will further increase the payload performance at a very low increase in recurring cost. Does not require a pilot. Let me underscore the word require. What was the latest hypersonic research vehicle this country had? Well, good old X-15. God bless its memory. I was always impressed the first or second time in my life I walked into the Dry Flight Research Facility. They have these, in the Visitor Control Center, they have these pictures. And there's this one photograph of the X-15, and behind it, there's a DC-3. And what's spine-chilling about that picture is that fewer years passed between the first flight of the DC-3 and that picture than had passed between that picture and now. Think about the indictment that this is on the space and aerospace community. So, if we could approach NASA or the hypersonic research community or anyone and say, hey, back in 1957, your first contract, the government's first contract, Air Force, with North American Aviation for the development of X-15, the original one, not the A version, was $50 million. Some more recent should-cost exercises indicate that X-15 today would have been developed with today's way of doing business, would have been between $700 and $900 million in kind of, it was a few years ago, $1993. What we said is, we offer you a bargain. We give you X-15 plus, and think of what you can do with it, for a contribution about $75 million. Now, lots of things evolved since that time. The NASA community decided, hey, that's interesting, but look, we're going to fly these 4 Minuteman or surplus rockets that the Air Force is going to give us under a high-step program, $40 million. We're going to do that, so we don't need your vehicle. On the other hand, the community that was thinking of developing reusable launch vehicles said, hey, wait a minute, we can do a lot of stuff with that. If anything else, you guys can be the ones that, since you're going to fly way before any of us are going to fly, you're the ones that can cope with the launch corridors. Can we overfly the corridors? Let me tell you something else that we can be the first ones to address. As a matter of fact, that's the kind of stuff that makes me sweat and stay awake at night. How do I trade the robustness that a reusable launch vehicle needs with the mass fractions that I need to go to orbit? Now, I'm cheating here because I have a 2-stage system, and I'm sweating bullets, guys. Originally, I had a 0.8 mass fraction on the booster. Now, we're going through these reusability and robustness arguments, and they're saying, you have to go down to about 0.755. So what do I do, guys? Do I go with a high-performance 0.8 and then risk that it won't last the 50 flights I want it to last? Do I go with the 0.755 mass fraction? This is the kind of sweating bullets that you don't sweat until you actually have to build something that goes to orbit. Now, in that sense, I hear a lot about, do we need X34? Do we need X33? Both, one of them. Let me remind everyone that in the history of X aircraft, if you look at all the X aircraft that have flown, they kind of fall into two categories, very distinct, clear categories. The first category are the ones whose purpose was to achieve a performance that had not been achieved before. X1, fly the speed of sound. X2, fly twice the speed of sound, although it didn't make it, somebody else did it. X15, Mach 6 at 200,000 feet. Those were all X vehicles whose usefulness was precisely in achieving a performance that hadn't been achieved before, and what technology or what means were used to achieve that performance was interesting, of course, that's why you did it, but they were secondary to achieving that performance. Another class of X aircraft. Now you have to be a real X aircraft nut to know. Anybody knows what X4 looked like? It was the first tailless swept wing aircraft. The kind that had killed 2 British test pilots, including Geoffrey de Havilland's son. Did that at X5, the first swing wing aircraft. X24, the first lifting body. Did any of those aircraft make the Guinness Book of World Records? No. They didn't go faster or higher than any of that. Didn't break any records, but they were there to study specific technologies or aspects or configurations which would then enable an increase in performance. In that sense, I see X34 and X33 as 2 different types of research vehicles. X33 is there to develop and prove the kind of technology that is required to achieve maybe single stage to orbit, maybe it's a 0.9 reusability, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But you have to have 0.93 mass fractions. You have to have very reliable, reusable hydrogen-oxygen engines. Now, whether X33 makes it to orbit or whether it carries any payload is immaterial, because it's an X vehicle in the tradition of X4, X5, and X24. X33 has as its objective, go to orbit in the 1,000-pound class at 1/3 the cost, and do it any way you want. Cheat if you have to. Let me tell you, it ain't easy. So it's trying to do, using cost per pound to orbit in the small satellite category, what X1, X2, which didn't quite make it, X15 did. So that's kind of the genesis of the deal. And I was actually going to spend a few minutes explaining how we got to the 2-stage 90% reusable. But unfortunately, my predecessor kind of upset me because he made exactly the same arguments I was going to make. How come we only have $100 to $120 million worth of money to do it? I mean, if we expect the market to increase by a factor of 3, and today we're launching something like 6 satellites a year, that means I have 18 satellites a year. If I could make $2 million recovery on each satellite, well, that's $36 million a year. So over 10 years, I should have $360 million, right? Wrong. Here's another way of looking at Dana's curves. This is simply a present value of a stream of income, $1 every year, at different IRRs, what its current value is. And you see something very interesting. Of course, if the IRR is 0, then indeed, if you have a buck 10 years from now, you have a buck today. But as the IRR depreciates downstream dollars, you get a very interesting effect. At least at this scale, this looks like asymptotes. They're not really asymptotes because it's a parabolic process, but for all practical purposes, you don't get any value added of the last 15 years of operation. As a matter of fact, around 10, you practically flatten out. Another way of looking at it, tell me how much, what IRR you need. Tell me how much you recover, how many dollars per flight, and I'll tell you what the multiplier is. Even if there's an infinite number of satellites out, I can only take, at say 25% and 18 flights per year, I can only take what I make on each flight and multiply by 50, and that's it, period. I don't have any more money. So we use that to do this
kind of analysis. And pray, do not take these numbers as exact. This is an old example, and there's a lot of cheating in these numbers. So use this only as an example of the type of analysis. We actually did a very detailed analysis. I'll point out the fallacies in these numbers, but the process is the right one. Fully expandable three-stage. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Solid motors, 295 seconds ISP, 0.86 mass fraction. On the expandable part, I'm kind of preparing the possibility of having a combination of things. Typical manufacturing costs, typical development costs, typical fixed operating costs. Now here I'm taking advantage of the improvements we achieved with Pegasus. I develop everything and get about $12 million per launch. Let's go to fully reusables. Now, at this size, as Dane or somebody else pointed out earlier, LOX hydrogen doesn't quite work volumetrically. I think it was Bob when he discussed dark cores. So I have to go LOX kerosene, and actually I would love to use these Russian engines that offer 340, 350 seconds ISP. Now I have a little trivia contest. I'd like to challenge anyone in the room to tell me why the Russians get 350 seconds ISP, whereas we can only get 310 or 320 for the same expansion ratio. Volunteer here? What does a higher chamber pressure do? No, temperature combustion is chemistry. Pressure can help you there. Reduces dissociation. The amount of energy that goes into dissociating the gas is reduced. You also have other tricks such as stage combustion, but the big breakthrough that we still haven't been able to get through it is that high chamber pressure does not just allow a smaller nozzle to come up, it allows less energy to be lost on dissociation. They figured that on a few years ago. Now, the problem with fully reusables is the sensitivity of the results, the risk that you're getting into. Now, the numbers are different for LOX hydrogen, but at LOX kerosene, look at the difference a 5,000th of a mass fraction number does. If I'm able to achieve a 0.935 mass fraction, boy, I get a real bargain. Well, I'm cheating a little bit here because I'm assuming a $10,000 per pound reusable development cost at a much higher mass fraction than this particular case here, and it just stands to reason that the development cost at these high mass fractions has to be higher, but I'm still kind of overlooking that difference. But it is a deal. Suppose I lose 5,000ths of a mass fraction. Now, because of the multiplicative effect of masses, I'm back at the expendable range. Now, again, don't take these numbers as gospel, but it gives you a feeling of fear, of concern. How am I going to go to my stockholders? How am I going to go to Wall Street and say, hey, I'm going to do this? And they say, look, one day you wake up cranky and you do a mistake in your calculation or your design and you end up here. No way. And that's kind of the reason why we ended up with a mostly reusable two-stage. That, and of course, this realization that the market would only take this, would only be able to afford 100, 120 million, and how much we'd have to go to a different user of the system for the additional financing that we needed would go proportionally up. And again, I'm kind of repeating Dana's argument. Unless the government, who funded or helped the Transcontinental Railroad, the canal system. See, Thomas Jefferson had it right. Transportation never justifies its own costs, but it is the key to a nation. If you look at the present air traffic control system, you think you guys pay for the air traffic control system when you fly? The government does it. You think the truckers pay for the entire interstate road system out of their taxes? These are all monies that come from the general funds towards the transportation system, which then of course benefit the entire country. Because where would we be without the interstate road system or without air traffic control system? That's kind of the end of my formal speech, and if anybody's full enough or isn't tired to ask questions, I'll take questions.
quick correction on the ATC. We as taxpayers do pay for that.
You're talking about the Airways and Airport Development Fund?
No, I'm talking about we as taxpayers are the government.
Oh, yes, you're absolutely right. Except it's not through tickets.
Right.
It's through our general revenues. You're absolutely right, Ron. Sir.
Antonio, there's a number of people in the room that are wearing buttons that say, I want to go. I'd like to know, will we be able to go on this spacecraft sometime in the future?
I've been in deep trouble for answering that question. Let me just say, I don't think this vehicle will ever carry anyone to orbit. But it does go to Mach 14. It does go above the official definition of being an astronaut, which is how many miles? 50? Thank you. Not only that, look at the size of the payload bay and the size of mass that you can carry, and theoretically you could put about 14 ejection seats in there. Let's be serious here. Let's be serious. We do want to use this vehicle as an honest-to-goodness X-aircraft. As I said a minute ago, this vehicle does not have to be crewed. But if you're doing something other than transporting things, and I still claim that in order to transport stuff, you don't need a crew. If you're carrying out an experiment in flight dynamics, in propulsion, where, what happens if the scramjet sniffs out? What happens if you come out of your flight envelope? There's no computer that, at least I know how to program, that has the human test pilot's ability to react and cope with very nonlinear situations. Well, you could imagine a module. Well, if we use this vehicle as a research aircraft, the first thing that happens is you remove the payload bay door. You replace it with a module that carries, for instance, hydrogen tanks for your scramjet, and additional instrumentation. Although the baseline vehicle carries 2 TIAC 80 megahertz bandwidth videotape recorders, this thing is going to have an incredible amount of recording bandwidth. When we first, oh, I forgot to show the schedule, but anyway, on our last powered flight for the first orbital flight with a real upper stage, we're going to release a dummy upper stage to check on the dynamics of separation and clearance. We're going to have TV cameras, similar to the one I showed you there, except we won't have to RF the signal down to the ground the way we had to do it on that Pegasus shot. By the way, it was number 4. I was the LPO on that flight. We'll take it on board. But you can imagine a pallet with all of the experiment support hardware that you need. And believe me, when you run a flight experiment, the money is not as much in the transportation system. It is on the payload, on the experimental payload. That's why having a recoverable test platform is so essential. Now, I could imagine 2 ejection seats on that pilot, and of course a little cockpit. I guess the passenger module would just have windows, so Mr. Yamamoto can use his Hasselblad to take pictures of the Japanese coast and the US coast when we do the 360-degree maneuver on top. But you can see a mission commander, or the pilot, responsible for the safety of the flight and coming out of the jams, and a test engineer running the actual experiment. So it is conceivable that the first crewed use of this vehicle would be not as much in carrying you and me, although I'd certainly pay. Some people accuse me of having created the entire Pegasus program just for the benefit of being able to be the LPO on the first flight. That's quite more true than that than people think. I hope one day to go on this vehicle myself, but certainly won't be on the first flight. It won't even be on the first crewed flight. I think I'll let a pro do that. So I can see a significant number of unmanned flights, maybe not the 100 that Dana suggested, but certainly at least 20. Not that you would establish the safety of this flight of this vehicle statistically. That cannot be done. We're not there yet. But I'd like to borrow an expression from Gary Payton, who says, RLVs will never be man-rated. Because the notion of man-rating is that you have essentially a very dangerous ICBM, and you do things to it so that a fool is gutsy enough to sit on top of it. That is not what X34, X33, and the RLVs will be. The RLVs will be reliable because economics demand it. Otherwise, we don't get investment back. Because we're going to overfly populated areas. So the FAA is going to demand the UAV type of reliability. Ergo, as a consequence, and without any man rating, we will have the reliability that somebody will be able to expose himself or herself 20 minutes to the flight. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I tried.
How suitable would X34 be for microgravity research?
Well, you do get 4 or 5 minutes of poor quality microgravity. You know, when you really go into the deep of microgravity, shuttle is a terrible platform. Space station is a horrible platform. This isn't any better. However, it would be okay for above the atmosphere photography or telescopes. We at our Space Data Division in Chandler used to do a lot of astronomy work where we just shot a telescope there for about 100 seconds and then back. Now this will be able to do that at a fraction of the cost and with a fraction of the re-entry Gs that we used to. So that could be a good subordinate application. UV photography, UV telescopy.
What sort of a development timeline do you have?
Sorry, I should have included that. Let me assure you, this is a success-oriented schedule. You see, when you budget a program, it's okay to budget monetary or funding reserves, because if you don't use them, you don't use them. But it's very tricky to budget schedule reserves, because if you want your schedule reserves to be useful, it's like a hole in a countdown sequence. You hit the hole, but you have to keep the hole even if you don't need it. Otherwise, you would launch before your time. Same thing for scheduling. If you put in blanks, so your schedule will hold, you reach that blank, and then what? You have to waste the time. So at least my philosophy is, don't put any schedule reserves. Put money reserves. We do have some on the X34 program. And if we are late, we'll use those reserves. So don't go back to me in 1997 and say, hey, Antonio, you didn't quite make your schedule. It's like Pegasus. Pegasus was flown for the first time 3 days short of 3 years before any of us even thought of the idea of building a launch vehicle. That's 3 years to develop an entire new launch vehicle. Well, guess what? We were 8 months late. But still, 3 years is 3 years. This is what we'd like to do. We're around here. We're kind of finishing the configuration decisions. We still have a lot of detailed design left to go. We're going to start ordering parts around this time. Early '96, we'll put together one of 2 airframes that we're going to develop in a leapfrog fashion. The 2 airframes will end up in the same configuration, i.e. full flight configuration, but we'll get there in a little bit different fashion, because the first one is going to be the non-destructive structure and ground vibration test, and will be the one with avionics will be used for the approach and landing test, very similar to the ones we did in shuttle in 1977, if you remember that. We'll be lift off, ascent 47, come in for a landing. We'll do that several times. Meanwhile, number 2 airframe, and these ALT tests are scheduled to occur in mid to late '97. Meanwhile, on the other airframe, we're going to integrate the engines and the tanks, and we're going to do a series of firings, static firings on the benches, but mimicking the entire operational sequence, i.e. loading the system the way we would do it on the ramp at Edwards, simulating the 2 hours flight to a drop point, firing the vehicle, simulating the minutes it takes for the vehicle to do its arc, re-enter and land. And then we'll save the system, clean the tanks, process it as we would on a turnaround, and we'll do it again. And we'll do it 3 or 4 times. So we'll mimic on the test stand the entire process of fast turnaround of the propulsion system. Then, starting in '88, we'll perform a number of progressively higher velocity powered flights. Now, the beauty of not being fully orbital is that you can explore your flight envelope in a progressive fashion. On the first powered flight, we will not exercise the TPS to its maximum stress. We will instrument it and analyze it, and that'll give you additional assurance that when we fly full blast for the first time in late '98, it will survive. And then, this is a quite fast-paced multiple flight test program, after which we will have one and only one within the development program flight with an orbital vehicle. So we kind of see the orbital vehicle as a separate development effort, if you wish. This will be the end of the X34 development program, flight test program, except as part of our quid pro quo with NASA, we're saying, hey, not only we're developing X34 so you can in the future use it for an experimental flight program, we're going to specifically give you, as part of the budget, the first 2 of these test flights. And we don't know, NASA doesn't know what specific items will be tested on those 2 test flights. We're right now looking at potential candidates. By the way, there are some candidate tests that can go even on the development flights. Things similar to the wing glove that Wright puts in some of our Pegasus flights to get boundary layer transition data and so on and so forth. So that's the overall schedule. Sorry.
What's the possibility of putting a capsule inside the sea and launching astronauts aboard?
If you use what I call Faget's rule, that says that you need 2,000 pounds per belly button to space. Now, this was a rule formulated a few years ago, so maybe today you can sharpen your pencil, and you only need 1,000 pounds per belly button. If we can build a in-flight light maintenance and re-entry capsule for about 1,000 pounds, then yes, we have a possibility. However, I would not fly on this or any future vehicles, at least initially, unless I had an ejection seat. This is an XR after all. So I'd say we're right at the borderline of being able to carry 1 person to orbit, given today's technology on life support and re-entry.
Yes, I've seen indications over the last few days that the program is being renamed to Y34 instead of X34 for political reasons. Have you heard that? Or
I don't know, and quite frankly, I don't care.
Okay. Well, I mean, is this true, or you don't care? So you don't
I didn't come up with the X34 name, so if somebody takes it away, why not? I don't. And what's in the name?
Right.
Could you give some comments on trying to, to a great extent, 2 stages, you're trying to get away with not quite going up to Mach 25 because it's a little too hard.
Yeah.
Rendezvousing with a tether, how much would that help?
With a tether?
Are there problems that would make it impossible?
Talking about tether as in the space tether experiment that was attempted with the shuttle recently? That only really works out between 2 orbital transfers. You have to be relatively close in delta V for that to work out. I mean, I can see a tether being used to boost the payload from 200 nautical mile orbit to 400, 300 nautical mile orbit. I don't think the flight mechanics quite work out at larger delta V differences.
Yeah, I guess the problem I have with X34 is your requirement to have the government fund you for $70 million. Certainly in the free enterprise system we live in, it's unusual for the government to pick one company out of a plethora of competitors and allocate 70 million tax dollars
Well, no,
so they can make a profit.
It's a quid pro quo. We're selling something.
Yeah, 2 launches.
No. We're setting the development of the next vehicle. You remember X15? How much the government paid for X15? Now, the number I quoted you, the $50 million in '59 or 200 today, didn't pay for any of the test flights. It was just the development costs. So, hey government, I'm developing for you a Mach 12 several thousand pound payload research aircraft for 70 million. So it's not a freebie. The 2 test flights are irrelevant material.
This is a commercial operational vehicle. How do you claim it's the next thing?
I don't care if it's next vehicle. Call it Y if you want. Commercial, operational? Well, could be a military vehicle. Would you call that operational? I just read Scott Crossfield's book, Always Another Dawn. And he was moaning and groaning that X2 was always late. It was getting late, and he was afraid that a military operational aircraft was going to exceed Mach 2 before X2 was ready to fly. Actually, other X aircraft exceeded Mach 2 before X2 did. I don't understand the argument. I mean, to what degree having the possibility of be useful denies the research application of a tool? In that sense, then the government shouldn't use PCs for research. A university should not get PCs. Because although a university can use a PC for research, watch out, PCs are commercial use, banks use it. So why does the practical application contaminate the research uses of the tool.
Well, in your analogy, the government didn't give IBM $70 million for designing the PC.
Oh, the government gave IBM a lot more money for those big computers.
Political opposition to that.
I'm only an engineer. Any more questions? I hope to.
Quick question. According to Apple, you're using JP5 for the rocket. Is that true? And so how hard is it?
No, I think it's JP7, which is the one that SR-71 uses.
Well, whatever.
7, yeah.
How hard is it to adjust the rocket to use JP rather than modular?
We'll find out. The reason why I use that is availability.
Right. Yeah.
And energy contents. Look, there's a lot of risk on X34. And those of you that think that, or some of you that may think it's a piece of cake that we could have done it with our eyes closed, I like to trade places. I'm sweating bullets, and so are all of our technical. It is difficult. And I really, my heart is out to those that eventually will develop the single stage to orbit. Boy, you don't realize how hard that is going to be. I hope that in any measure we can contribute to our experience. Now, let me give another example of contribution experience. Do you think that DCX looks like X34? Well, you cannot believe the amount of experience and data that DCX is producing that is applicable and useful to us. They recently flew differential GPS for the first time. Guess what? That's what we're going to fly for landing. So we had 3 or 4 of our engineers down at White Sands the other day. They came back raving, said, you should have seen how they load the cryogenics. It's the right thing to do. You should see the arrangements they have with range safety. Somebody mentioned they don't have a destructive range termination system. By the way, small note, it is not true that rocket flight termination systems explode. The contract that we have with the range safety is that thrust be terminated. Now, it turns out that one of the most effective ways of terminating thrust, especially with solids, is to punch a hole through them. When we terminate, and we've terminated the Pegasus flight only once, the range safety hit the button. There was no boom, because that circular shaped charge cut a neat hole through the case. Pressure went down, thrust terminated. The boom is a side effect, particularly when you have liquid propulsion systems, of flight termination. But the range does not